you could build a new city from scratch, how would you do it? We're all familiar with the problems of big cities: heavy traffic, urban decay, insufficient housing, poor transportation links, not enough recreation areas, bad planning, lack of services, and so on. These problems have dogged cities for eons because cities, for most of history, have simply evolved haphazardly, expanding in all directions. New concepts and technologies like sewage systems, public parks, subways, stadiums, bike lanes, electrical substations, and highways have to get jammed in amongst or on top of aqueducts, temples, stables, and palaces of bygone eras. And as cities have grown, so has the scale of their social problems: crime, homelessness, social isolation, poverty, and inequality. Such challenges are by no means unique to cities, but it's in these densely populated areas that they are most often experienced acutely. But in the early 20th century, a new architectural movement called Modernism sought to change all that, and through new technology and radical thinking, sought to redesign the home, office, and city for the new era. More than simply improving the aesthetics and functionality of our world, the modernists argued that good architecture and careful urban planning could support the restructuring of society itself and foster a more humane form of social and economic relations. In other words, if we redesigned our homes and cities, we could reshape our society and even ourselves. Of course, it would be impossible to demolish Los Angeles or New Delhi and redo them from scratch, so the modernists were usually limited to projects of a smaller scale. But they got the chance to really test their theories in Brasília, the newly commissioned capital of Brazil. Instead of a handful of isolated apartment complexes or individual buildings, Brasília would be an entirely new modern city built from nothing. As a result, it could shoulder the full weight of the modernist vision for a new urban utopia. In recognition of its singular embodiment of this architectural ethos, the city of Brasília was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. It was one of the first modern monuments to receive such a designation. With so many ancient wonders, we often must use our imagination to conjure up the people and places that once animated these sites. Not so with Brasília. This is a living and breathing city whose revolutionary design is not even a century old. But such recognition also tends to obscure the many debates, criticisms, and controversies that surrounded the creation of Brasília from the start. After all, literary and cinematic visions of the future rarely age well. But what about a vision actually poured out in concrete? This was both the promise and peril of Brasília. Colonized by Portugal from the 15th century, Brazil is the largest nation in South America, and at 166,000 square miles, slightly larger than the contiguous United States. Yet for most of its history, its vast interior was relatively undeveloped, and nearly all of Brazil's cities sprang up along the coasts. The jewel in the Portuguese crown was Rio de Janeiro, then, and in many ways now, the leading city of Brazil. But Rio's location has always been a mixed blessing. Though it enjoys a large and safe harbor, the city is sandwiched in between the ocean on one side and the Serra da Mantiqueira mountains on the other. As its urban population grew over the centuries, it became harder and harder to squeeze all of Rio's residents into its limited space. So, in the middle of the 19th century, several prominent Brazilians began advancing proposals to help develop the interior of the country by relocating the capital further inland. These proposals gained further inspiration from a Roman Catholic priest named John Bosco. In 1883, Bosco claimed to have dreamt that he was taking a train across the highlands of Brazil from the Andes to Rio de Janeiro. Between the 15th and 20th degrees of latitude, he said, quote, There was a long and wide stretch of land which arose at a point where a lake was forming. Then a voice said repeatedly, "When people come to excavate the mines hidden in the middle of these mountains, there will appear in this place the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. It will be of inconceivable richness." This promised land corresponded to what is known as the Cerrado. Situated between 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level, the Cerrado is an ecoregion containing just under 800,000 square miles of tropical savanna, wetlands, and wooded scrubland. At the time of Bosco's vision, it was largely uninhabited, home to an average of 2 people per square mile. And even today, despite covering nearly a quarter of the land surface of Brazil, less than 10% of the population live on the Cerrado. Nevertheless, this was the landscape against which the Brazilian version of Manifest Destiny would be implemented. In 1891, the newly promulgated Brazilian Constitution even went so far as to set aside some 5,500 square miles of land in the Cerrado, with the explicit provision that it one day become the site of a new federal capital. That promise took a long time to materialize. As the Franciscan friar Vicente do Salvador observed as early as the 17th century, Brazilians, quote, clung like crabs to the coastal settlements of the Atlantic, and the concept of a new inland capital struggled to gain wide acceptance. There were also political challenges. With just a mere 5 years in office, no Brazilian president could be assured of enough time to build a new capital from scratch. In all likelihood, early investments would dry up in the face of logistical obstacles. Construction would slow to a crawl, and the next administration would abandon the project, consigning its predecessor to a legacy of ridicule and folly. Then came the election of Juscelino Kubitschek as president of Brazil in 1955. Kubitschek campaigned explicitly on the promise to build the new capital. He set a target date of 1960, just 4 years down the road. Critics said that it could never be done, and that other neglected regions of Brazil were more deserving of such large-scale investment. Nevertheless, Kubitschek pressed forward with his bold plan and announced an open competition for the design of a new capital city of 500,000 people. The winning entry was submitted by the Brazilian architect Lúcio Costa, whose proposal was sketched out in 15 freehand sketches on 5 medium-sized cards. Costa's design was heavily influenced by the modernist vision of a Swiss-French architect by the name of Le Corbusier. Just a few years before Kubitschek came to power in Brazil, Le Corbusier had put the finishing touches on Chandigarh, a planned modernist city in northwestern India. Now, Lúcio Costa would attempt to do the same in Brasília. Costa and Le Corbusier were firm believers in the conviction that traditionally planned cities served only to reinforce inequities based on class, gender, and race. The chief culprit was privately owned capital, which was deployed by political and economic elites to tailor urban space to their own privileged interests, at the expense of everyone else who toiled away in densely packed and unsanitary communities. The modernist city, however, was intended to change all that. Rejecting the grandiose and flamboyant buildings of neoclassical, Baroque, or colonialist architecture, this new, rationally planned city would serve the interest of the common folk. Fundamental to this revolutionary concept was the idea that streets themselves would have to be eliminated as a type of social space. You see, modernist designers thought of the spatial layout of a city in terms of voids and solids. In a typical city, beholden to the interest of wealthy capitalists, solids, or privately owned buildings, dominate the urban grid and impose clear restrictions on our daily mobility. Voids, which are mostly streets or occasionally public squares or parks, are barely detectable. Their thin contours wrap around solid buildings like the arteries around our heart. And like a diseased heart, These unsanitary arteries provide one of the only places for social circulation among the less privileged members of society. But in the plans for a modernist city like Brasília, this spatial layout is reversed. White voids now dominate the urban layout, with solid buildings in the minority. In other words, urban space has now been repurposed to serve a socially liberating function. Instead of urban cesspools rife with poverty, crime, and restricted mobility, the modernist city will provide everyone with his or her own spacious bubble of rationally planned urban space. Plazas, parks, boulevards, playgrounds, instead of becoming the exception, they become the norm, the starting point. It all sounds great, right? But could it work in practice? Brazil was about to find out. On April 21st, 1960, the new capital of Brasília was formally inaugurated, a full 9 months before the end of Kubitschek's term as president. It had taken only 41 months to turn the chief elements of Costa's vision into an urban reality. An army of workers, both international and domestic, had descended upon the city, allured by the exciting vision, but also by the attractive and steady pay from the state-backed construction firm. The construction workers soon formed their own tight-knit communities, living in cities of their own in areas not earmarked as part of the development plan. Interestingly, some of these worker camps would evolve into permanent suburban communities of the new capital, like Candangos. From above, the new capital bore a striking resemblance to a bird or a plane in flight. This was a deliberate choice, with Costa even referring to the core part of his planned city as the plano piloto, or pilot plan. Taking their inspiration from Brasília, all Brazilians would now fly boldly into a new, transformative future. The pilot plan consists of 2 major axes. The residential axis, or the wings, flap along a north-south direction. By contrast, the monumental axis, or the body of the plane, flies from west to east toward Lake Paranoá, an artificial body of water created by a dam. In accordance with the dictates of a rationally planned modernist city, each axis forms the backdrop for a distinct set of urban functions. Not surprisingly, the north-south residential axis lives up to its name. Here is where we'll find the original showcase living quarters and spatial arrangements intended to create a better urban life for residents of all economic backgrounds. The monumental axis is also fairly straightforward. Here are all the major public buildings and government ministries that undertake the administrative duties of the Brazilian state. Let's start our tour with the residential axis. The defining architectural feature here is the superquadra, or superblock. Grouped into northern and southern wings, the superquadra are residential blocks that measure about 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet. That's nearly 3 football fields on every side, far larger than a typical city block. Designed to house about 3,000 residents each, the superquadra is a self-contained housing complex that was intended to bring people of different economic classes together to live in a common social environment. To do this, the various components of a superquadra had to be uniform. So each block had 6 to 8 slim rectangular apartment buildings with a maximum height of 6 stories. Inside, the apartments themselves are laid out in a similar design, differentiated only by the number of rooms and the view you can get from the windows. In Costa's original plan, all government bureaucrats and lower-level functionaries would be forced to live inside the superquadra. This would make a janitor the next-door neighbor of the Minister of Defense. As promotional literature for the superquadra was eager to point out, these apartment blocks were, quote, all equal, same facade, same height, same facilities, all provided with garages and constructed of the same material, which prevents the hateful differentiation of social classes. That is, all the families share the same life together, the upper echelon public functionary, the middle, and the lower. And this life could be very pleasant indeed. The white voids of the superquadras were filled with greenery. Trees, grass, parks, and ponds, all suitable for a lengthy stroll. One study has shown that the superquadra of Brasília have more than 5 times more green space per resident than someone living in the city of Sao Paulo. And to maintain an airy feeling of open nature, most of the superquadra's apartment towers were built on pillars, which raised the first floor above the ground and allowed for unobstructed views and breezes. Now, because the superquadras were supposed to be self-sufficient residential blocks, each one was provided with everything that a thriving community would need, such as schools and restaurants. Every 4 superquadra shared additional amenities, such as a post office, swimming pool, church, theater, police station, and automobile repair shop. The idea was to provide an attractive substitute for the traditional Brazilian bairro, or neighborhood. And indeed, most residents of Brasília's superquadras have praised their open recreational concept and the safety they provide for rambunctious children to wander around unsupervised with their friends. But many of these same people have also complained that the superquadra is a poor substitute for the lively bairro. With all buildings and services fronting onto the inner spaces and away from the street, the superquadra can sometimes feel like a marvelous green preserve isolated from the outside world. You wouldn't dream of walking more than 1 or 2 superquadras away from your own, as there are big distances between them, and the streets themselves are rarely shaded. From the beginning, the superquadras and their residential segregation from the once lively urban street have sparked a lot of debate. In 1960, the American architect John Portman paid a visit to the newly completed city of Brasília and called it, quote, an inhuman place. Nothing but great blocks of buildings arranged in military order. He said that after just one look, he had, quote, no desire to walk down the street, turn the corner, and suddenly discover something, because I already knew what was there. This sense of spatial disorientation, which was a deliberate aim of modernist planners, led to the coining of a memorable phrase to describe the reaction of many new migrants to Brasília. This is the phenomenon known as Brasilite, or Brasilia-itis, the modernist city as a form of psychological trauma. I once experienced a similar form of itis while living in a socialist-inspired super apartment complex in Beijing. I often longed to break out of the enclosed urban bubble of privilege in which I spent my days. But the moment I made that long trek out to the unwelcoming street, I wanted nothing more than a car to get around. Now, as for the other chief element of Brasília's pilot plan, the east-west monumental axis, well, it proved a lot less controversial. In fact, if you ever manage to visit Brasília, you probably won't ever stroll through a superquadra, which are difficult to access if you don't live there. Instead, you'll most likely spend all your time gawking at the splendid modernist architecture that was designed for its civic and administrative spaces. Many of them bear the imprint of the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer, who was personally invited by President Kubitschek to design the showcase structures of the monumental axis. Like Costa, Niemeyer was strongly influenced by the work of Le Corbusier, and today is considered one of the greatest architects of the 20th century. The 2 chief axes of Brasília intersect at the city's central bus terminal, itself a vast complex. From here, we can head east, preferably in a car, to see most of the major public monuments. The first striking building is the Claudio Santoro National Theater. Designed to resemble a Mesoamerican pyramid, albeit with asymmetrical slopes, it features a pair of distinctive facades. On the northern and southern sides, a sculptural program of irregular cubes covers the walls. In line with the modernist desire to upend all our assumptions about the proper use of space, these cubes make it hard to distinguish between vertical and horizontal orientations, an effect made more dramatic by the asymmetrical shape of the pyramid. Like nearly everything else in Brasília, the goal is to inspire new ways of thinking about our relationships with the buildings and spaces that we inhabit on a daily basis, in the hope that one day we will be able to create a more equitable and humane society. As the promotional literature for Brasília once declared way back in the 1950s, quote, "Thus is raised, on the plateau, the children who will construct the Brazil of tomorrow, since Brasília is the glorious cradle of a new civilization." Next up, just to the south of the National Theater, on the other side of the monumental axis, we find two unforgettable structures designed by Niemeyer: the cultural complex of the Republic and the Cathedral of Brasília. Both appear in the general outline of large spheres, but there the resemblance ends. The cultural complex is a dove-white half-dome structure with 3 elevated ramps providing pedestrian access to the interior. But each ramp stands apart from the others. One straight and flat, one attached ramp curving up the southern side of the dome, and another unattached ramp curving around the northern entrance. From the north, it almost appears like an unpainted model of the planet Saturn. Inside, ramps also curve up and around the massive interior space, which is used to host various cultural events and exhibits. Just adjacent to the cultural complex is the Cathedral of Brasília, an icon of modernist architecture. The cathedral also consists of a half-dome sphere. But this sphere is partially obscured by 16 curved concrete columns that rise 130 feet above the ground, creating an hourglass shape that figuratively represents hands that reach toward heaven. The exterior appearance has also been likened to the crown of thorns worn by Jesus. Inside, sculptures of 3 suspended angels hover among the natural light that pours into every nook and cranny through the stained glass windows that comprise the ceiling. Though Niemeyer himself was a member of the Brazilian Communist Party, it appears that he was not averse to creating a transcendental spiritual experience for the faithful. Indeed, far from being architectural traditionalists, many church leaders enthusiastically embraced the modernist vision as well, seeing it as dovetailing with their own social agenda for the new age. And John Bosco, the visionary priest who foretold of a new era in central Brazil, was not forgotten. His sanctuary, completed in 1963, provides one of the most stunning experiences in Brasília. Just a few blocks from the cathedral, you can experience perpetual twilight and glimpse the heavens above, with light filtering into the sanctuary through thousands of stained glass blocks. From the cathedral, we can continue our trek eastward along the esplanade of the ministries. Spread out over a half-mile of open grassy expanse, like the landscaped green avenues of other major Western capitals, the esplanade is hemmed in on its northern and southern sides by more or less identical office buildings. These house the country's various government ministries, such as the Ministries of Defense and Agriculture. These slim, rectangular tower blocks bear a striking resemblance to the superquadra apartment buildings, with their modest height barely rising above the trees that have been planted between them. Finally, at the eastern terminus of the esplanade of the ministries, we arrive at the Square of the Three Powers, a large, rectangular stone plaza surrounded by the architectural symbols of Brazil's executive, legislative, and judicial branches. On the northern end is the Planalto Palace, which is where the President of Brazil carries out his daily work. It bears a striking resemblance to the Alvarado Palace, the President's official residence, which is located on a peninsula jutting into Lake Paranoá a bit further to the east. Both buildings make use of curved concrete columns that stretch from the ground floor to the roof, with a rectangular glass box structure in the inner recesses. In the case of the Alvarado Palace, however, the addition of an adjacent pool on the premises reflects a mirror image of this striking modernist design on its surface. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Alvarado Palace was the first major building to be completed in the city and embodies many of the design principles of modernist residential architecture. The use of modern materials like glass, steel, and concrete, a bright and airy interior that connects seamlessly with the outside world, open-plan living, and clean, minimalist interior spaces and decorations. Even though it's more than 60 years old, these spaces still feel very fashionable, a testament to the influence of the Modernists on contemporary design. The other memorable building on the Square of the Three Powers is that which houses the National Congress on its western side. Approaching from the esplanade of the Ministries, the visitor encounters a green basin that dips below the grassy plain. The roof of the main structure is thus located at ground level. But that's not all there is to this striking assemblage. Two twin towers rise up from the center of the roof. On either side of the twin towers, we find another half-dome structure, but this time, one of them is flipped over on its bottom. The northern dome, without any surface-level access points, houses the Senate, while the inverted dome to the south houses the Chamber of Deputies. The design echoes the United Nations headquarters in New York, a landmark of modernist architecture, and which was also principally designed by Oscar Niemeyer and Le Corbusier. But unlike the New York manifestation, the National Congress is set amongst broad green lawns and reflecting pools. These were designed with the public in mind, and when it opened, broad ramps allowed people to walk onto the roof. The Modernists were also about transparency, openness, and democracy. And what could be more democratic and symbolic than the public being allowed to walk around and over the building of their representatives? Unfortunately, issues of security and vandalism pretty quickly put an end to that. Once we've gotten our fill of the monumental axis, we can exit the pilot plan of Brasília by driving over a bridge that crosses Lake Paranoá to the southeast. The bridge, completed in 2002 and featuring distinctive arches that cross over the highway from side to side, is named in honor of President Kubitschek, the man who almost single-handedly willed Brasília into existence. But the bridge also reminds us of how no master plan can ever truly embody the original vision of its creator. This is because the bridge brings us face to face with what is often referred to as the Lake Mansion District. Thousands of luxurious single-family homes built by prosperous government officials who did not share the egalitarian vision of Brasília. It did not take long for the more resourceful residents of the superquadras to flee the open confines of the pilot plan and build their own enclaves of privilege on the shores of Lake Paranoá. Even though the modernists hoped their architecture would inspire a more egalitarian restructuring of society, human nature is not quite that easy to change. And while Costa and Niemeyer built an incredibly futuristic vision in Brasília, like any design, it is anchored in the thinking of its age. As any visitor to Brasília is quick to discover, getting around the city without a car is not easy. In the 1950s, city planners everywhere, particularly modernists, had fallen in love with what they saw as the liberating potential of the automobile. For a whole generation of architects, the car was the future. The ordinary person was no longer limited by the tyranny of geography, and these well-oiled machines could liberate cities from their tightly packed traditional forms. You no longer needed to live close to where you worked or played, because the car could shuttle you anywhere. Now you could design far-flung suburbs where people could live in large houses with big yards, while still being able to drive into the cities for work, shopping, and leisure. With its vast public spaces and large white voids, Brasília is thus entirely premised on the idea that everyone will have a car. Costa over-engineered the road system as a result. It's built for speed and capacity. The two major highways that run along each axis were even designed without any stoplights or stop-and-go intersections. Nor are there traditional curbs or 90-degree street corners where pedestrians might congregate. In Brasília, the streets are for fast-moving automobiles and little else. This wasn't unusual at all. In the 1950s, many cities in the world were remodeled along similar lines, with new roads and highway lots carving their way through urban centers. But by the 1980s, the problems with this vision were becoming apparent. Though Brasília largely avoided the issues of traffic and congestion faced by other cities, the rising prices of fuel and cars were not anticipated. And as the cost of living in Brasília skyrocketed, poor migrants who worked in the service sector found themselves priced out of the capital. Instead, they created unplanned satellite towns in the suburbs, which forced them to undertake long and expensive commutes both to and within Brasília. The spread out, low-density nature of the city makes mass transit hard to operate. The Brasília Metro, opened in the 1990s, is almost as long as the one in Rio de Janeiro, yet services a population only a quarter of the size. Nor could Costa predict the more contemporary problems of emissions from cars and the modern movement towards active transport. The vast distances of Brasília and the broad highways and plazas with little shade make walking or cycling impractical. Indeed, many of Brasília's roads were built without even sidewalks. All of this is to say is that Brasília faces the same challenges every city does as times and technologies change. Today, Brazil's capital has expanded far beyond its original pilot plan, and the people who live in and around Brasília have adapted its buildings and public spaces to uses unanticipated by its modernist planners. But while the modernists of Brasília may not have created the future-proof urban utopia of which they had dreamed, no one can deny the breadth and scale of their ambitions, nor the boldness or the beauty of what they created. A tour of Brasília today will present a fascinating mix of contradictions, in which the egalitarian and utopian ideals of a modernist city planned from scratch must be reconciled with the social habits and urban expectations of a diverse group of migrants. For nearly everyone who lives in or visits Brasília sees its innovative design with a fresh set of eyes, and, in his or her own subtle way, contributes to its further innovation.